It wasn't the kind of thing I'd usually notice. A slip of paper, partially crumpled, left on the kitchen counter next to an empty coffee mug. The receipt was almost lost among the morning clutter: mail, yesterday's grocery list, a stray sock from the dog's nightly raids of the laundry basket. I might have tossed it out without a second glance if not for the faint, unmistakable logo of the boutique printed at the top. The name alone was enough to stop me in my tracks. Éclat, the high-end lingerie store she'd always said was too over the top for her taste. I picked it up, scanning the details. It wasn't the purchase itself that caught my eye, it was the delivery address. A different street, an unfamiliar zip code. I didn't recognize it. But that didn't make sense, did it? She'd told me, just 2 nights ago, that the lingerie was for me, a surprise she was excited to share. Yet the receipt clearly showed it hadn't been delivered to our home. My chest tightened as questions began to swell. Who was at this other address? Why hadn't she mentioned it? And most troubling of all, why was the delivery slip still sitting out in plain sight, as if she hadn't even thought to hide it? For a moment, I considered setting it down, leaving it there on the counter and pretending I hadn't seen it. Maybe it was a simple mistake. Maybe she'd had it sent to the wrong address by accident. Maybe there was some innocent explanation that would dissolve this uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. But I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. My hand lingered on the paper, the boutique's elegant script staring back at me like a taunt. She hadn't mentioned any issues with the order, hadn't said anything about it going to the wrong place. So why wasn't it here, with her, with us? I heard her footsteps behind me before I could put the receipt down. She came into the kitchen, wearing the cozy robe she always wrapped herself in after a long day. "Hey," she said, her tone light. "What's for dinner tonight?" I turned, holding up the slip. "I found this on the counter." She froze for half a heartbeat, just long enough for me to notice. Then she laughed, reaching out to take it from my hand. "Oh, that." "Yeah, I forgot to tell you, I had it shipped to work." "To work?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Yeah," she said, her smile unwavering. "I didn't want it sitting on our porch all day. You know how I feel about packages being left outside." Her explanation was smooth, almost practiced. But it didn't line up with what I was seeing. The address on the receipt wasn't her office, it wasn't even close. "This doesn't look like your work address," I said, tilting my head to study the paper. Her smile faltered, just for a second. "Oh," she said. "It must be the fulfillment center they use. They ship it there first, then to my office. It's some new thing they're doing." I nodded slowly, letting her words settle. "That's a little weird, isn't it?" "Maybe," she said lightly. "But it's no big deal. They're a fancy boutique, you know? Always doing things their own way. As long as it gets here eventually, who cares?" She placed the receipt back on the counter, her movements casual. "Now, what were you thinking for dinner?" she asked, changing the subject. Her tone was so easy, so matter-of-fact, that I almost believed her. Almost. But that tiny hesitation, that brief flicker of something in her eyes, stayed with me. I answered her question, talking about dinner plans as if everything was fine, but my mind was already turning. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I didn't want to accuse her of anything without more information. Still, a quiet, nagging doubt had taken root. And as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the receipt on the counter was more than just a simple mix-up. The next morning, the receipt was still on the counter. I half expected her to throw it away or tuck it somewhere out of sight, but there it was, sitting in the same spot, daring me to take another look. She breezed through the kitchen, pouring herself coffee and scrolling through her phone, completely unfazed. If she was trying to cover something up, she wasn't acting like it. I stared at the address again. It wasn't her office, and it wasn't anywhere I recognized. I started to wonder if I'd misunderstood, if maybe there really was some fulfillment center that handled their shipping. But something about the way she'd answered my questions the night before, how quickly she'd changed the subject, how that smile had faltered for just a second, kept nagging at me. Her story didn't sit right, and the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. While she was in the shower, I grabbed my phone and opened a map. I typed in the address from the receipt, curious to see where it might lead. The results came up quickly, showing a residential street across town. No fulfillment center. No office building. Just a house, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood I'd never been to. I stared at the screen, my heart sinking. A house. Not her office. Not anywhere she'd mentioned. What was she doing shipping something there? Who lived there? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. I tried to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe she had a friend who'd offered to hold the package for her. Maybe she'd mixed up the addresses somehow. But if that were true, why wouldn't she just tell me? When she came back into the kitchen, I forced a smile and handed her the mug of coffee I'd poured for her. "Did you get everything sorted out with that delivery?" I asked casually. She glanced at me, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "The lingerie," I said, gesturing toward the receipt. "You said it was being sent to your work. Did it show up yet?" Her smile returned, but it felt a little too quick, a little too practiced. "Oh, I think it's still in transit," she said, taking a sip of her coffee. "They can be slow sometimes. I'll let you know when it gets here." She leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone like it was just another ordinary morning. But the knot in my stomach tightened. The address wasn't for her work. It wasn't for any place she'd mentioned. And yet, she stood there, completely at ease, as if nothing was amiss. It was as if she was daring me to believe her, daring me to let it go. But I couldn't. Not now. Not after seeing that address. I kept quiet for the rest of the morning, not wanting to start an argument or make accusations without proof. I told myself I'd wait, that I'd see what happened when the package arrived at her office. Maybe she'd show it to me, proudly declaring that it was meant for me all along. Maybe it really was an innocent mistake. But in my heart, I wasn't so sure. I couldn't stop thinking about that house, about the unknown name on the receipt, about the way she'd smiled at me like there was nothing to worry about. And as the day went on, I realized that I couldn't ignore it forever. I needed answers. I just didn't know how to ask the questions. The questions refused to let me rest. I spent the next day trying to push them aside, to convince myself that I was overthinking things. Maybe it really was a fulfillment center. Maybe the map was wrong. Maybe I'd looked at the address too quickly and misread it. But every excuse I came up with felt thinner than the last. She was out running errands when I decided to take another look. I pulled out my phone, opened the map again, and stared at the location. It wasn't a mistake. It was definitely a residential house, in a part of town I'd never even driven through. I zoomed in on the street view, scanning for anything that might explain it, signs, office buildings, anything, but it was just a plain, quiet neighborhood. No boutiques. No shipping centers. Just a house. My chest tightened as I leaned back against the couch. If it really was just a simple shipping mix-up, why hadn't she mentioned it by now? Why had she smiled so confidently, so calmly, when I asked her about it again? The weight in my stomach grew heavier with each passing minute. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, I tried to act normal. I didn't want to come off as suspicious. I asked about her day, made a few jokes, and laughed at one of her stories about a coworker. But inside, my thoughts were racing. I was watching her carefully, waiting for some sign that she'd bring it up on her own, that she'd tell me, "Oh, by the way, the package finally came in." But she didn't. She didn't say a word about it. As the night wore on, I started to feel a subtle tension building between us. I wasn't sure if she could tell that something was on my mind, or if it was just my own guilt for doubting her. But every time I looked at her, I couldn't help but wonder, why didn't she tell me the truth? When we settled onto the couch to watch a movie, I thought about asking her again. I wanted to be direct, to say, "I looked up the address on the receipt. It's not your office. It's a house. Can you explain that?" But the words caught in my throat. What if I was wrong? What if there was a perfectly reasonable explanation and I just hadn't thought of it? What if, by confronting her, I made things worse? So I kept quiet, sitting there next to her as she laughed at the screen, as if everything was fine. My heart pounded in my chest, and the knot in my stomach tightened. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. I needed answers. But I still didn't know how to ask the questions without risking everything. I woke up the next morning knowing I couldn't wait any longer. The weight of unanswered questions had settled into every part of me, turning simple moments into mental battles. Each time she smiled, each time she kissed me goodbye, it felt both comforting and alien. How could someone I loved so much, someone I thought I knew so well, carry on so easily when something was clearly off? I told myself I'd wait until the evening, when we were both home, and I'd bring it up directly. But as the day went on, my resolve began to falter. What if she had an explanation that made me look paranoid? What if I was wrong and I damaged our trust by pushing this issue too far? The thought of putting my fears into words, of confronting her face to face, made my stomach churn. It was one thing to replay scenarios in my head. It was another to demand answers I might not be ready to hear. When I got home that evening, she was already cooking dinner, humming a tune I didn't recognize. She greeted me with a warm smile, like every other day. I kissed her on the cheek, muttering something about traffic, and joined her in the kitchen. I watched her move around the space, completely at ease, and tried to remember what it felt like before these doubts took hold. "Everything okay?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "Yeah," I said, though my voice sounded flat even to me. "Just a long day." She nodded, turning back to the stove. "Dinner's almost ready. Hope you're hungry." I wanted to say something, anything, to bring up the receipt, the address, the lingering doubts that wouldn't leave me alone. But instead, I helped set the table, making casual conversation about my co-workers and the weather. She listened, laughed at my jokes, and talked about her own day as if nothing was wrong. As we sat down to eat, I finally worked up the courage to ask. "Hey, did you ever figure out that delivery issue?" I said, trying to sound casual. She looked up, her fork halfway to her mouth. "What issue?" "You know," I said, "the lingerie. You mentioned it was being shipped to your office, but the address on the receipt looked different." She set her fork down and tilted her head slightly, her smile never wavering. "Oh, that. Yeah, it got sorted out. It's fine." "Where did it end up?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "It was just a mix-up," she said breezily. "They rerouted it to the office after all. No big deal." Her answer was smooth, confident, almost too perfect. It should have reassured me, but it didn't. Something about the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she'd anticipated the question and prepared a response. "That's good," I said, nodding. "I just wanted to make sure it wasn't lost or anything." "Nope, all good," she said, picking up her fork again. We finished dinner, her mood as warm and cheerful as ever. But I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my mind. If it was just a mix-up, why hadn't she mentioned it sooner? Why had she been so quick to change the subject every time I brought it up before? And why, when I asked again tonight, did her answer feel like something she'd practiced? I sat on the couch later, staring at the TV but not really watching, while she scrolled through her phone beside me. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to let it go. But the knot in my stomach was tighter than ever. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, constantly questioning everything she said, everything she did. I needed the truth. I just didn't know if I could handle it when I finally heard it. I told myself to trust her. I told myself to stop overthinking. But trust isn't something you can force. It's not a switch you can flip on and off. I tried to push the doubts aside, tried to lose myself in the routine of daily life, but those unanswered questions kept tugging at me. I couldn't stop thinking about the address, about her quick, easy responses, about the strange tension in the air that no one else seemed to feel. One evening, when she was out with friends, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the receipt again. It was still there, tucked under a stack of mail. I pulled it out and held it in my hands, reading it for what felt like the 100th time. The boutique's elegant logo, the line item for the lingerie, the unfamiliar address, it was all there, clear as day. And every time I looked at it, the knot in my chest grew tighter. I opened my laptop and typed the address into the search bar, hoping to find some new clue. But it was the same as before, a residential home, not far from downtown, on a street I'd never driven down. The house was ordinary, unremarkable, with no clear connection to her work or our lives. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Was it a friend's house? A co-worker's? Someone she trusted enough to receive an expensive purchase like this? I knew I was spiraling. I knew that sitting there, searching for answers online, wasn't going to fix anything. But I couldn't stop. I clicked through pages of search results, read reviews of the boutique, checked forums for anything that might explain why a high-end store would ship to an unexpected address. Nothing added up. The questions were the same as they'd always been. And I was no closer to the truth. When she came home later that night, I put on my best attempt at a smile. "How was it?" I asked, hoping she wouldn't notice the tension in my voice. "Fun," she said, dropping her bag on the counter. "Just the usual gossip and too much wine." She kissed me on the cheek, then turned to rummage through the fridge. I watched her move around the kitchen, as effortless as ever. There was no sign of guilt, no sign that she had anything to hide. If it weren't for that piece of paper on the counter, I might have believed that everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine since I found the receipt. I stayed up that night, long after she went to bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. That I was making something out of nothing. That she was telling the truth, and I was the one creating a problem where none existed. Yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was right there, just out of reach. And I couldn't keep pretending it didn't matter. I needed answers. I just didn't know how to ask for them without everything falling apart. The moment finally came when I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I'd spent too many nights staring at that receipt, replaying our conversations, and trying to connect dots that never fully aligned. I told myself I'd be calm, that I wouldn't accuse her of anything, that I'd simply ask her to explain it once and for all. But my heart was racing, and I could already feel the words catching in my throat. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, when I walked into the room. "Hey," I said, my voice steady but low. She looked up, smiling. "What's up?" I held up the receipt. "I found this a while ago. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." Her smile faltered, just for a second. "You're still on about that?" she asked, her tone light but with an edge I hadn't heard before. "I just need you to be honest with me," I said. "The address on here, it's not your office. It's not anywhere you've mentioned before. Can you tell me what's really going on?" She sighed, setting her phone down. "I already told you. It was a mix-up. A mix-up that sent it to someone's house." I pressed. "That doesn't make sense." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she leaned back against the couch. "Why are you making this a bigger deal than it is? It was a mistake, okay? I had them fix it. End of story." I studied her face, searching for any sign that she was telling the truth. But her tone felt defensive, her words too quick. "If it was just a mistake," I said carefully, "why didn't you tell me about it sooner? Why did you act like it was no big deal when I asked the first time?" "Because it wasn't a big deal," she said sharply. "I didn't want to turn it into something it wasn't. I don't understand why you're so fixated on this." "Because it doesn't add up," I said, my voice rising. "You keep brushing it off, but the address doesn't match what you told me. And I can't stop wondering why you won't just explain it." Her jaw tightened, and she crossed her arms. "I've explained it. More than once. You just don't want to believe me." "I want to believe you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I really do. But the way you've been acting, like you're hiding something, it makes it hard to trust what you're saying." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stood up, brushing past me. "I can't do this right now," she said. "You need to let it go." I watched her walk into the bedroom and close the door behind her. My chest felt tight, my head spinning. I wanted to follow her, to demand answers, to make her tell me what was really going on. But I couldn't move. I stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling the weight of the silence between us. It was the first time I'd ever truly doubted her, and it wasn't a feeling I could shake. Trust is fragile. Once it cracks, it's almost impossible to put back together. I didn't know where we would go from here. I didn't know if we could ever rebuild what had been broken. All I knew was that the truth, whatever it was, still felt out of reach.